Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur.
When we started going out, I learned it was a marijuana smuggler.
I was able to infiltrate a lot of organizations.
It was a signal. If we don't go now, we're going to burn Oscar. Quick, quick.
We started hearing from organizations in Mexico that people were being taken.
Los policías estaban al servicio de los cárteles.
Scores of movies have been made in the last decade on Mexico's drug war. Some focus on the blood and gore sensationalism, and others on the serious political issues behind the war. Today, on Interviews from Mexico, we're going to be talking to a film director who made a new movie that looks at the human face behind the war.
Ayer fueron encontrados 49 cuerpos.
22 muertos.
Un comando armado atacó a balazos. El incidente más violento ocurrió a las 10 horas con 14 minutos.
To talk about the portrayal of Mexico's drug war on film, we're very pleased to be here today with Bernardo Ruiz. Bernardo, thanks for being here with us on Interviews from Mexico.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here with you, Laura.
Bernardo is a film director who has just produced the film Kingdom of Shadows. Bernardo, what was the main purpose of making this film in particular about Mexico's drug war?
I have for a long time wanted to make a movie in which I could get a deeper look at the topic, to go beyond the crime sensationalism. Before, I had made another documentary called Reportero about journalists from the weekly Zeta in Tijuana and in Mexicali. And the movie talks about the risks that these journalists confront. In the case of Zeta, they had lost 3 of their colleagues. So then, in a certain form, I was familiar with the topic, and what I was trying to do was make another kind of story where I could unite different perspectives in one movie.
We know that the movie focuses on 3 people: a human rights activist in Nuevo León, a former drug smuggler in Texas, and a counter-narcotics agent also in Texas. Why did you choose these 3 people?
I was interested in doing some kind of triptych, or a triangle of different points of view. I started to look for people who could be like, whose stories could open a window to the issue. First, I looked for people who had powerful stories, exciting stories, but more than that, people who could help to understand the phenomena of violence in a perhaps more profound way. With Sister Consuelo Morales in Monterrey, we see with her the situation of disappearance and forced disappearance in this country. But we also see the families that are fighting for justice, looking for their loved ones, and that obviously this is an experience that is already well known in many parts of Mexico, many regions, above all in the case of the 43 students. So what I was looking for through their stories was to give the public a window, especially the international public, on something happening in some corners that have been all but forgotten by the international media.
But not necessarily direct victims of the war. These are people who have a slightly different perspective. Why did you make that choice?
The 3 participants in the movie, the former trafficker, the federal agent, the nun, the sister who is a human rights defender, the 3 of them help us also to see the historical context. I started the project with the question, how have we gotten to this point where so many people are disappearing, where there have been so many dead? How do we get here, and what roles do the 2 countries play? For this, we have the perspective of 2 Texans, one American and a Mexican, American federal agent, together with the perspective of the sister. For me, it was very important see that there is a very important relationship, a love-hate relationship, I would say, between Mexico and the United States, and that is important to explore this issue. Beyond the issue of drug trafficking, the question is, how do we get to this point where there is like a perfect storm between the United States and Mexico?
Exactly. So now you've mentioned 2 points that I wanted to take up. The first is this historical view, because that was another feature that struck me about the film, that you have this former drug trafficker in Texas who was actually arrested in the 80s, and he's had a long time to take the long view on his experience, and he also notes some significant changes in drug trafficking. And then you have this counter-narcotics agent who has retired actually from the undercover part of the work and is also kind of looking back on it more than the direct involvement day to day. So tell us what that gives the movie, you know, to have that historical perspective.
We're at the time now where works about drug trafficking are abundant, especially in the world of fiction. There's the Netflix series, there's Narcos, and there's a lot of telenovelas. There's the movie Sicario. There are a lot of portrayals, right? So in the documentary field, there are also other documentaries that have looked at the issue. Where I saw a gap was in the historical context. For me, focusing on the violence without historical context is it's a lack of, or it's a way to avoid doing justice to the issue. What I found interesting as a producer was to see how the violence had evolved over the years, over the decades, and with the 3 characters that I chose, through them we see how the business changed, no? The business in the shadows, in the years of Don Henry Ford. He worked in an era when there was one strong drug lord who was Amado Carrillo Fuentes. He worked for him, he met Amado. He worked for the Juarez cartel, and we see how little by little the business gets fragmented. For various reasons, it begins to fragment.
And it becomes much more violent.
Exactly, that's what generates violence, and later the head-on war of, back then, the former president Felipe Calderón Hinojosa.
Which Consuelo Morales mentions as, again, a factor in increasing rather than decreasing the violence.
Exactly, no? So what the movie is trying to do is see how the business has changed and how the fragmentation has impacted the communities, especially in Mexico. How it has impacted civil society in Mexico.
The other point I wanted to take up has to do with this binational perspective. You have 2 people in the United States, U.S. citizens. You have 1 person in Mexico, and normally people just look at what's happening in Mexico, or they look at it from a policy perspective. What was the point? You've mentioned that the film is to create a U.S.-Mexico dialogue on this. How do you intend to do that? What's the purpose there?
Look, through the distribution of this movie, we're in theaters in Mexico, we are in theaters in the United States, and also in digital platforms. It is fascinating to see the different audiences' reaction to the movie. They focus on different things. For example, there's a lot of familiarity with the case of the issue of the disappeared. No, this of course we need to deepen the investigation of these cases and continue, but the public already knows about the issue more or less. But in the United States, there is a big need, I would say, to learn about and understand this issue. So this is one part. Here in Mexico, the public has reacted. They are interested, they are fascinated by the story of Don Henry Ford, the former drug trafficker, and Oscar's story. So up to a certain point, what we are trying to do is tell stories that probably are already known by one country and share them with another country. And vice versa, no? The idea is to have a binational dialogue. Next year, in 2016, we're going to be on public television on PBS, and we're going to try to generate a public debate, a public dialogue in the United States about the issue. Above all, about the U.S. responsibility for this conflict.
So you're basically bringing the perspective of each side to each other and bringing the debate up to a level where they have the same kinds of information and idea of how the other lives this same terrible problem that we have in the border area. Well, we're going to go to a short pause now. We'll be right back. Don't go away.
They don't follow any sort of rules.
Cuando él desapareció tenía 17 años. Nosotros nunca nos imaginamos que las autoridades eran... ¡Porque viva
We're back with Bernardo Ruiz talking about his new movie on Mexico's drug war from a binational perspective. You mentioned the disappearances and how many people in the United States don't know that part of the history. What do you see as the causal link between the drug war, that of course is supported by the U.S. government, and this wave of disappearances that we're suffering not only in Monterrey and the border area, but throughout Mexico?
For this production and for former projects, I've been able to interview many people in the field of security, human rights defenders, activists, and also in some cases people who have information about organized crime. I think that according to what I have learned and what I hear from my colleagues, it is a perfect storm. In contexts where there's no reliable public security, each person could be an enemy or a spy. So in this context where everything is suspicious, there exists a kind of a lack of confidence that gets generated. I think that this is a key point. I think that the other thing is impunity, because unfortunately in some regions here in Mexico, life is cheap. And this to kill someone, murder someone, torture someone, there are no consequences. So this is a fundamental thing in the business. Of course, U.S. consumption has played a very important role in giving organized crime groups resources, but here there is a judicial issue that has to be taken into account. That is the impunity.
El consumo estadounidense ha jugado un papel muy importante en dar recursos económicos a grupos de crimen organizado aquí en México, pero aquí sí hay una cuestión jurídica que hace falta, ¿no? Existe la impunidad.
And the human rights defender mentions that in the case of the disappearances that she works with, there was a huge increase that appeared to be attributable to the security forces themselves, as well as what she calls a reign of terror, specifically and apparently purposely created by the drug cartels, no? So we see both of these things adding into the problem, no?
There's a moment in the movie that for me is a key moment when Nick Steinberg, who worked at the time for Human Rights Watch, tells us that the cases of disappearance and forced disappearances in Monterrey, in the period when he was investigated, reminded him of the cases in Chile and Argentina under the dictatorships of Videla, of Pinochet. So it's there where this question, this issue comes in of what role does the state play? What role do the armed forces play? And I think that that is a fundamental question, no? We know that there have always been these connections. Well, we know that these connections have always existed, you know, and in some cases there have been documented cases. A part of this line that I find interesting is that in the case of the Zetas, we know that some of the military group were trained in the schools, rather in the School of the Americas in the United States. That's something they tell us in the movie. So to investigate these links, of course, it's very difficult and extremely dangerous, but I think that it's necessary to investigate these links.
And this question about the role of the authorities is kind of left open in the movie because we see both sides. We see the human rights defenders meeting with the authorities in the state of Nuevo León and trying to open up a dialogue. We see new police training programs. Do you think that there's been improvement, or there's improvement on the Mexican side in this respect?
I think that it depends on who you talk to. I think that, for example, in the case of Monterrey, there are many people who think that things have gotten better in terms of security. If you talk to human rights defenders or activists like Sister Consuelo, she would say that in some ways things have changed, but in all these cases of disappearance,
there's a lot of victims that are absolutely fed up.
There's a need to do something with the existing cases, right? The cases where we don't know, and these families have a right to the truth, and they should have more information about what happened with their loved ones. And these cases are open. They should be investigated more seriously.
deben ser investigados de forma más profunda.
You mentioned that you did a lot of interviews for this movie, and some of them are quite striking, such as the interview with the Zetas and some of the footage that you got from the police training camps. What's the backstory on how you got this material?
I think that it is the task in the field of documentary filmmaking. It's always hard to get access. I've always been very open with the entities that I work to work with. In the case of the civil force in Monterrey, they opened the doors to us. There wasn't much difficulty. They wanted to show us what they were doing. They opened the doors and they let us come in and film there. And there really wasn't difficulty there. I think this represents something. That is, they are proud of their work and they wanted to share it. In the case of the interview with the young Zeta, I collaborated with Diego Enrique Osorno, the Mexican journalist who has written a lot about organized crime. He wrote a book about the Zetas. In fact, he produced the interview, and it comes from his contacts. I think that it is necessary to include the interview because it demonstrates a dark part of the business, which is the lack of sensibility on the part of organized crime groups to the point that disappearing a body is not a big deal for them.
Well, it's an amazing inside perspective for the viewer. We'll go to another break. We'll be right back. Don't go away.
When we started going out, I learned it was a marijuana smuggler.
I was able to infiltrate a lot of organizations.
It's a signal. If we don't go now, we're going to burn Oscar. Quick, quick.
We started hearing from organizations in Mexico that people were being taken.
Los policías estaban al servicio de los cárteles.
We're here with Bernardo Ruiz, film director, talking about his movie Kingdom of Shadows. Another part that I found interesting is that one of the main characters is an anti-narcotics agent from the United States, and it's actually a very favorable portrayal. Whereas, of course, there's been a lot of criticism both of their operations and of the overall policy. Do you think U.S. policy in terms of anti-narcotics work in Mexico is on the right track?
One of the things that I try to do in the movie is respect the logic of each character, no matter if I agree or I don't agree with the perspective. I think that the most important thing for the spectator is to have a panorama, to have a mosaic of the problem. And what I'm looking for through the portrait of Oscar Agaliciev is to understand his perspective from his point of view. And I do this with each of the three participants in the movie. And even himself in the film says that we need to talk more about the role that the United States plays, especially the consumer. To have a federal agent saying this, who has worked all of his life in counter-narcotics forces, recognizing this, I think that is a very powerful thing, no? It's very powerful. Look, we are at a moment where there's a lot of debate about how to improve, especially how to reduce damage. And obviously the United States, not long ago, it removed a little of the Merida Initiative support for reasons, according to the United States government, of human rights.
Ha quitado una parte del apoyo en el Plan Mérida a México por razones, según el gobierno estadounidense, de derechos humanos.
And there's a whole legalization debate, not just in the United States, but now here in Mexico as well.
Of course, we are in a very interesting moment where I think that due to the damage that this wrongly named war has caused, we are already starting another type of conversation, both in the United States and in Mexico.
Well, that brings me to the point of when we talk about U.S. policy and when we talk about this movie, there are some reviews that have said that the movie, one of the refreshing aspects is that it doesn't have a political agenda. Did you have a political agenda?
Yo veo este trabajo más que nada como
I see this work more than anything else as a project, a hybrid of journalism, work, and film, no? And for me, if I have an agenda, it is to humanize parts of this conflict that unfortunately have been exploited by other types of production. If there is a heart of the movie, for me it is the families of the disappeared. If I have an agenda, it's to provide a platform for these voices so they will get more support. But beyond that, what I seek to do is to depict these distinct perspectives, respecting the points of view of the three people. So my agenda as a documentary filmmaker is to paint a portrait, a mosaic, for a public to understand on an intimate level what is going on in this wrongly named war.
Why do you say, wrongly named war on drugs?
I think that when we say war, we're not talking about things that we have to recognize, no? Which are the economic inequality, public health, addiction, also the responsibilities of the economic interests. For example, the banks that launder money for organized crime.
More like the behind-the-scenes roots of the problem, you mean?
I think that's exactly it. What we should have another type of conversation, and sometimes when we use certain terms, it limits our thinking or perspective. So I think that when we talk about root problems, we could start to see the problematic in a different way.
You've talked about then as one of the main goals to open up this dialogue and to bring this issue out of the shadows. What do you think the role of the movie is in this?
I don't think that a movie is going to change the world, unfortunately. But what I do feel like we can do is to exactly generate another type of dialogue, to make the dialogue deeper, and to go beyond the debates, beyond the discourses of many politicians. In the United States, we're in a period where there are many politicians with an anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant discourse. In fact, I sense that this is a very poor perspective, no? We need to get deeper, go deeper, and see that there are things that connect us, for better or for worse, that connect these two countries. And we need to start speaking another way. We need to recognize the existing connections and talk about the bonds that unite us. Only then, I think we will be able to understand this conflict and to start talking about how we can reduce harm on both sides of the border.
So you think by having these three people from the two different countries with very particular stories, I mean, they're not representative of huge groups, they're very particular stories, but that elucidate certain aspects, you can begin to join together the perspectives, especially on this issue, but in general, because there's a lot of cultural barriers and political barriers between the two countries. No?
Yes, I think that this movie can bring together people who otherwise wouldn't be in a dialogue. I showed the film in El Paso, Texas, and half of the audience was federal agents, and the other half were activists.
What was the response?
There was a very powerful debate, a very interesting debate, but I think that this is the idea of the movie. It's to bring people together who generally don't talk to each other, precisely to overcome these cultural barriers or ideological barriers and get these people together to generate another type of debate. Who knows if it is possible to create a deep debate, but what I'm seeing that this movie is able to do is to bring people together in another type of debate that I, at least, haven't seen in other situations.
Well, Bernardo, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thanks so much for being here with us on Interviews from Mexico, and we hope to have you back someday. And thank you. I'm Laura Carlson. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.